Trade Finance in Africa, brought to you by Africa Export-Import Bank.
Well, welcome back to Open Exchange. Now, intra-Africa trade, that's trade within Africa, is estimated at about 10% versus the 63% seen within Western European nations, as an example. So there are cumbersome import and export procedures, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, unsupportive policy frameworks. Those are some of the reasons for low intra-regional trade numbers. Sipho Moya, who is Africa Director of ONE, joins me now to discuss the way forward for Africa's trade. I've mentioned the organisation that you're with as ONE. Is that how you say it, or is it ONE?
It is ONE.
Because you never know.
Now, is ONE.
That struck me, that number, that percentage of intra-African trade compared to say, Europe. What are the issues here? Because I think, firstly, of long queues at borders. So it's physical barriers to people getting through the borders quickly. And then on the other hand, we hear that there are issues with settlement, with payment, with customs, with excise, that kind of thing.
Yes. Look, this is a really big challenge for the African continent, I think, as far as development and economic growth and progress is concerned. If you look at the equivalent number in North America, trade between North American countries, I think, is roughly 40%. Between Asian countries is 52%. In Latin America, which is the lowest after Africa, is 22%. So you can see that really, at 10%, 12% intra-Africa trade is very low for a continent of 1 billion people. You expect much more. And I think part of the explanation or the solution to that is the need for greater regional integration. Regional integration is really, really key, very important. Infrastructure, ports, computerization of custom systems, and just the institutional strengthening, I think, I have to say from that point of view.
But these are things that can be fixed. One heard this morning about Kenya trying to streamline in terms of its trade with Rwanda and Uganda. So that apparently at the moment they have a whole bureaucratic procedure at the ports, and then they have another one when it crosses the border from Kenya into those other countries. It needs an application of system and political and business will, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And like I said, the infrastructure, the political will, the computerization of systems, all of those things really are important, because unless that happens, if you look at it currently, Africa's trade with the rest of the world is 88%, because it's only trading 12% with itself. And I think about 60% of that is with Europe, instead of trading within itself.
But what's the problem? We know all the barriers.
Yes.
Why aren't these barriers, why haven't they been solved sooner? What's the AU doing? What is it there for if it can't help solve these problems?
Part of the problem is the economic structures, the structural setup of African economies, which were traditionally designed to support the colonial centers overseas. So that has not changed very much, so it's still sort of economies that are relying on natural resources, exportation of natural resources, and so on.
Also, I suppose comfortable in the sense that you know who your client is.
Yes.
If it's West Africa and you speak French, then you know you've got that channel.
Yes.
In a way, you don't have to explore alternatives, although you should.
You should, you absolutely should. As I said, it's a continent of 1 billion people today, and the opportunities are immense in Africa. And you asked me what the African Union is doing, what the African Development Bank is doing. I think those two premier organizations on the continent are actually doing a lot in terms of promoting trade. A couple of years ago, the African Development Bank put up a $1 billion fund for trade facilitation and trade finance, because that was during the time of the global economic slump, when African countries really needed a lot of help. It's also spearheading infrastructure development on the continent. Currently, only about 22% of road networks are paved in Africa. It's untenable, to say the least. It was very difficult to make progress under those circumstances. So under the ADB's program for infrastructure development in Africa, or is it Partnership for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, the idea is to grow the infrastructure, and the estimates are that $32 billion is going to be needed over the next 5 years just to bring infrastructure up to par on the continent.
Now, you have a particular expertise in agriculture And that you would think is the one area where African countries would get enormous benefit from trading with each other. In terms of fresh produce, doesn't have to travel as far, particularly with the neighbours in a particular area. Have they made particular progress there, or is it the same obstacles as elsewhere?
Actually, infrastructure is so important for agriculture on many levels, particularly road networks, markets, and so on. Because if you think about it, I mean, there's a lot of post-harvest, waste in Africa because of lack of infrastructure. Farmers and agribusiness are actually not able to process the agriculture produce into sort of, juices or canning or drying, and that sort of thing. So. You have a bumper when there's harvest, and then you have famine when there is no harvest. So that's also another really important aspect. So, I mean, talking about infrastructure, it's really the heart of development at this stage. It's important for agriculture, it's important for health, it's important for education. Infrastructure is important for everything, and it is the spectrum of infrastructure. It's not just the roads, it's the electrification of the continent.
Well, talking about that, President Obama talking about a $7 billion contribution to... Now, on the one hand, it sounds a lot. It's not that much, $7 billion when you're talking about power stations. The private sector scheduled to put in $9 billion, I think was the other number mentioned. Is this going to happen?
I think it's going to happen, and it's about time that it happened. And I think the African Development Bank is playing an important role in ensuring that it facilitates some of these investments. But the important thing about the $7 billion, you're saying it doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in fact, what it is that it will catalyze private sector investment. The $7 billion alone will probably bring access to power, to lighting, for an additional 20 million people on the African continent. That's a lot of people that don't currently have power. 70% of Africans don't have access to power. So we're very excited about President Obama's Power Africa initiative because, like I said, it will catalyze additional investments from the private sector, from other donors, and so on. And I think that there is an agreement and a realization among the experts and, everyone who loves this continent that unless we can power this continent, the costs of production will remain very high. Mothers will continue to die in labor. Vaccines will continue to perish because of lack of refrigeration. Kids will not be able to perform. So the outcomes across, sectors are relying on, powering Africa. If you talk to businessmen, they'll tell you that 70% of business people in Africa will tell you that the biggest challenge for them is power and electrification. That really drives up the cost of...
Electrification of the continent is the key. I still think they could do more with the bureaucracy as it is now to sort things out, but, we need the will for that too. That was Dr. Sipho Moyo, who is Africa Director of One.
Trade Finance in Africa, brought to you by Africa Export-Import Bank.